For the first time, the Russian military is facing the loss of Crimea. In June 2026, the elite Russian units on the Kinburn Spit, which had long blocked Ukrainian forces from reaching the peninsula, were forcibly driven out. What's more, Ukraine retook it not with a frontal assault, but by cutting the supply lines. Russian radars near Kerch were knocked out, and the bridges feeding the front were severed. Cut off from resupply, even Russia's elite airborne units were forced to abandon their positions and flee. The strategic Kinburn Peninsula had been under Russian occupation since 2022, but now the Ukrainian flag flies over that position. At exactly this moment, Zelensky declared a new 40-day wave of pressure to squeeze Russia. When the two developments come side by side, the needle turns in a single direction. The land gateway opening onto Crimea. The first place to pry open Crimea's door was Kinburn, so the story has to begin there. Kinburn is a narrow 40-kilometer strip of land stretching between the Black Sea and the Dnieper-Bug estuary. It looks tiny on the map, but its position makes it critical. It directly controls every sea approach to the ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson. In other words, it is practically a lock on the northwestern Black Sea. When Russia seized it in 2022, it gained a major bargaining chip. It could put the nearby town of Ochakiv and the surrounding villages under fire at any moment. For 4 years, this narrow strip of land was the symbol that the south was still contested. Now that symbol has changed hands. And yet the loss here is far greater than it appears. According to military analysts, retaking Kinburn strengthens Ukraine's hand in the Black Sea and opens the way for a possible land move toward Crimea. So what was gained is not merely a piece of ground, it is a position that could shift the balance in the south. Still, one point should be made clear from the outset, or we will make this larger than it is. The Ukrainian flag was raised over a building at the eastern tip of the peninsula. Under heavy fire, the Russians began to abandon their positions and pull back surviving personnel. Even so, even the Ukrainian Navy avoids saying the peninsula has been fully liberated. Fighting continues in the area, and the enemy has not entirely withdrawn. So this is not a moment of victory, but the crossing of a critical threshold. And how that threshold was crossed is what tells the real story. A fair question comes to mind. How did those elite airborne units, considered the apple of Russia's eye, give up an entire position without a fight? The answer does not lie in a classic assault. Kinburn was not stormed with tanks and infantry. For months, Ukraine kept that narrow link between the peninsula and the mainland under pressure with drones and precision artillery. The result ripened slowly. The ammunition, fuel, and even basic food going to the Russian regiment in the area were cut off. Look at it for a moment through that soldier's eyes. You are on a besieged coastal strip. Your ammunition is running out, your fuel is dwindling, your water and food are gone. The other side isn't even coming closer, it is simply closing the road behind you. At a certain point, there is no longer any meaning in holding out. Indeed, the Russian command hastily withdrew the units it could not supply. They left heavy equipment behind. The summary of the whole campaign is hidden in that scene. To bring down a position, you don't have to storm it. It's enough to show the people inside that staying there is no longer possible. What's more, this is more than a small change of color on the map. On a front that hadn't moved for months, logistical pressure turned into a concrete withdrawal for the first time. Indeed, Ukraine's southern command said it hopes that one day its tanks will reach Jankoy in Crimea. Eyes are already turned beyond the sand strip, toward the peninsula. There is also a matter of timing. The real message is hidden there. While all this was happening, Zelensky placed a counter on the stage. He announced that he had approved a 40-day influence operation for the SBU. The aim was not fancy words. It was to force Moscow to end the war and come to the table. Ukraine's leader framed this no longer as waiting, but as leaning in first. In fact, this operation did not appear out of nowhere. For months, Ukraine had been wearing down Russia's energy and logistics infrastructure with medium and long-range strikes. The 40-day declaration means putting a clear frame and a timetable around that quiet campaign. Scattered blows suddenly acquired a name and a deadline. For one side to put a clear date on the calendar is, in itself, a form of pressure. A vague threat can be managed, but a threat with a known date pushes the other side to think every day, today or tomorrow. The logic is simple too. What usually brings a country to the table is not goodwill, but the point at which continuing the war becomes unbearable. That is exactly the goal of the 40 days, to raise the cost of war above the cost of peace. This counter has a diplomatic face as well. It is no coincidence that Zelensky has been acting more boldly of late. Behind the scenes, it is said that even Washington is telling Kyiv to be braver. On the other side, Putin continues to reject calls for talks in a neutral country. So this counter is being set up as a lever both on the field and at the table. Its first traces appeared not only in the south, but thousands of kilometers inside Russia. Long-range drone swarms targeted the energy infrastructure that fills the Kremlin's war chest. An oil depot in Krasnodar, refineries 1,500 kilometers away, even waves of drones sent over Moscow. This is no longer a few symbolic strikes, it is a pressure that has lasted for months and repeats almost every night. The calculation here is the same as the one at Kinburn, only on a larger scale. When a refinery deep inside catches fire, that single blaze simultaneously chokes the fuel headed for the front, the revenue headed for the budget, and the army's breath. The oil those refineries sell turns into money, and that money into shells and drones. Cut the source, and you cut the weapon at the far end. And a relatively low-cost drone is what does it. The cheap one strains the expensive one thousands of kilometers away, in its own home. There is also a concrete sign that this pressure really bites. As its own refineries were hit and supply tightened, Russia began having to import fuel. A country that sells oil has come to buy it. So a single drone thousands of kilometers away opens a gap felt both in Moscow's treasury and in its fuel depot. That revenue was funding the war. As it narrows, the trigger at the far end strains too. Thus, Moscow is forced into a constant choice. Either keep the expensive systems back to protect the capital, or send them to the front and leave home exposed. Either option has a price. That is exactly what Ukraine is doing, forcing the enemy to give up something with every move. And here is what really corners Russia. Moscow pulls its air defenses toward the places it could never afford to leave bare, its capital, the Kerch bridge. But the defensive blanket is short. Cover one end and the other is uncovered. That is precisely why the gaps opening in the south and in Crimea aren't closing. The attacker alone chooses where to press, the defender has to watch everywhere at once. In the end, an army with no heavy resupply, no fuel, and no safe road, however large it may be, stops being a threat and becomes a vast weight that has to be protected. Here we cover these stories of logistical encirclement with evidence and without exaggeration. If you want to stay tuned, subscribe. The sharpest edge of the campaign appears at Crimea's true throat, Kerch. And here the sequence reads like a military lesson. The eyes first. Two large Russian radars near Kerch, the Nebo and the Skala-M, were knocked out. These systems are no ordinary boxes, they were the eyes and ears of the battlefield, tasked with spotting and reporting Ukraine's missiles and drones while they were still far off. Once they were blinded, a gap opened in the wall of the defense. Why does the sequence matter? Because a blind defense is the most fragile defense. Once the radars fell silent, the sky suddenly turned into a more open corridor for Ukraine's drones and missiles. What slipped through that gap were the bridges feeding the front. First, the resupply bridges to the east were targeted, one after another. The lines were strained. But the real blow was inside the peninsula. For the railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal, Ukrainian special forces had a single sentence: it no longer exists. That bridge was no decorative detail. It was the main railway artery running from Kerch into the interior of Crimea. When that artery was cut, passenger trains stopped across the peninsula. The Russian administration cancelled most of the services. What remained was just a handful of trains serving the entire peninsula, and all of them passed through a single gate, Kerch. And repairing this bridge was not easy either. Russia sent a repair crew to fix the damage, but Ukraine's drones were waiting for them and targeted the incoming repair vehicles as well. So, bringing down a bridge is not a one-time job. Even the effort to put it back up is constantly watched and cut off before it begins. Repair itself thus becomes a risk in its own right, and the damage stays in place for days. Zoom the picture out, an entire peninsula connected to the world by a single thin line. And that line is under constant watch. A single bridge, a single train, becomes the sole gate of a whole region. As that gate narrows, everything inside, military shipments and ordinary life alike, shares the same blockage. Lately, military analysts have begun using a striking word for Crimea: a cauldron. A pot closing in on itself, its exit narrowing. Picture a garrison, crowded and armed, but living on dwindling fuel and ammunition that arrives late. In time, such a force cannot attack. All its energy goes into merely surviving. In the end, it becomes not a force holding ground, but a crowd struggling to feed itself. There is a detail that goes unnoticed but determines everything. That famous Kerch bridge everyone knows has long been unable to carry heavy military loads because of structural damage from past blows. It cannot bear armoured vehicles or giant fuel tankers. The irony is this: Russia built that bridge as the symbol of permanence, yet today it cannot even bear the weight of its own army. That is why it had leaned the backbone of military shipments on the ferries working the strait and on the port terminals. Now that bypass route is under strain too. Black smoke has risen from the terminals on the Kavkaz and Chushka sides. The bridge itself is no longer a safe line either. At every threat of an air attack, it is closed to traffic for hours, which is why trains heading to Russia are delayed for hours. The bill for this landed squarely on ordinary life. In Crimea, fuel was rationed, the hours of shops and public transport were cut back, and electricity went into scheduled outages. It reached the point where the Russian administration even struggled, at one stage, to find the fuel to move its own prisoners within the peninsula. The essence of the method fits into a single sentence: first blind, then choke. Now lay these pieces on top of one another. With Kinburn changing hands, Crimea's western flank is more exposed than before. This is a development that gives concrete ground to a possible future land operation. Note this: Crimea's gate is being pried open not at the front, but in logistics. What sets this moment apart from earlier ones is that three things are happening at once. On one side, there is a concrete position changing hands in the field. On another, a systematic campaign gnawing at Crimea's logistics, and on top of it all, an openly declared timetable. Each of these, on its own, has happened before, but the three coming together turns scattered headlines in a single direction. The pressure around Crimea is no longer chance, but deliberate and measured. History whispers a powerful lesson at this point. What connects Crimea to the mainland has, from the beginning, been only a few narrow straits. That is why the peninsula's fate has always been written at those passages. In the Crimean War of the 1850s, the Russian Empire suffered a heavy defeat right here, when its supply lines clogged in the muddy steppe. In 1941, the Nazis fought a fierce battle at the Perekop and Chongar isthmuses to enter the peninsula. In 1944, when the Red Army retook it, it again entered through those same narrow straits, and the defenders, cut off from resupply, could not hold at those isthmuses. At those passages, the issue was never merely courage, the issue was always supply. Whoever held the straits won, whoever could not, lost to hunger and exhaustion. The geography never changed, only this time, the besieger and the besieged have traded places. Today, the scenario is no different for Putin. For years, the Kremlin sold the Russian people the image of the leader who brings back lost lands. Now it faces the risk of being remembered as the administration whose access to Crimea is growing harder. Because a leader's power rests in part on the story he tells. In the middle of the "we won, we took it back" narrative, the lowering of a flag over a place held for years is a fine crack in that story. A single crack does not bring down a wall, but everyone sees it. Not only the public, but the power centers around him too. Control is not as absolute as it seemed, and such doubt is most dangerous in closed systems. But here too, we should not exaggerate. Bridges can often be repaired. The degree of damage from many of these strikes has not yet been independently confirmed. Russia isn't sitting idle either, producing an adaptation to every blow. And the 40 days are a declared goal, not a guaranteed outcome. The picture is real, but not every detail of it is certain. We should also not forget this: a gate being pried open is not the same as passing through it. Retaking Crimea entirely would require force, time, and risk on a completely different scale. What is happening today is that holding that peninsula is becoming a little more expensive for Russia every day. This is not a moment that ends the war, but it is a process that quietly shifts the balance. So what is this whole campaign really after? Let's not jump too quickly to a single answer. Perhaps this counter is meant to loosen the ground for a land step to be taken later. Or perhaps the intent is never to go in at all, only to make Russian forces collapse under their own weight. Or perhaps the whole calculation is aimed at the table. Every line cut is pressure that brings Moscow one step closer to negotiation. Perhaps all of these are working at once, looking for a single, clear intent, maybe asking the wrong question from the start. Still, whichever possibility comes to pass, one thing remains unchanged. Ukraine's target is no longer the front line, but the artery that feeds that front. And for the first time, a clear span of time, 40 days, has been attached to that artery. Do you think these 40 days will pry Crimea's gate wide open? Or will Russia manage to absorb this pressure and reweave its lines? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll keep telling the behind-the-scenes story of deep war and logistics in an evidence-based way. If this analysis was useful, like it, share it, and subscribe.